Now we're going to look at indicators of the Drak's size. You've already seen the one on the left, which is torso and arm elongation. The one on the right complements that with leg elongation. Her legs are more than twice the length of her torso, which I measure from the hips to the shoulders. If her torso is about 2 feet long, that puts her legs at 4 feet, and the neck and head at least a foot. So in total, she must be over 7 feet tall, and that's with the torso at its human size. If you put the elongated torso and legs together, the total height must be over 8 feet, or 2.5 meters.
Here's the male imitation with an elongated lower abdomen and groin, as well as legs and forearms. He's also reverting the shape of his pelvis and legs, so it's clear that it's not a human body. I didn't put that censor mark there, but judging by how small it is, it's very likely that he's ungenerated his penis and testicles. Obviously, they can't show themselves without genitals, so I understand why he covered that up. Of course, we know they don't have external genitals in their native forms. The sex organs are inside the abdomen, and the groin is blank.
The camera is at Sigourney's shoulder, so this would be the viewpoint of someone who's about 5 feet tall. Judging by this, the newborn could be close to 10 feet tall, or 3 meters. I saw a video in which one of them claimed that he's a 10-foot tall Arcturian, and now I know that he was telling the truth. "10 feet looks plausible in this shot as well. My guess is that a creature of this size with a large tail would weigh somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds, 270 to 360 kilograms. Most reptiles continue to grow as they age, and the same may be true of the Draks. I wouldn't be surprised if the elders were considerably larger than this. I know now that all of these giant humans are Draks. Humans don't get this big. Robert Wadlow on the left was almost 9 feet tall, so his human imitation form was close to his natural height as a Drak, and he was still growing at the time he supposedly died. He's reverting his left ankle joint in this photo to show that he's a Drak. The other one, Johan Peterson, is also reverting his ankle joints, where his lower legs are clearly bent forward below the knees. So you have this creature that's at least twice the size of a human that can compress its body down to human size, and they can actually compress down to much smaller forms than that. Now I'm going to show examples of compression on their human imitation forms, which will demonstrate the extent of this ability. This one is compressing the circumference of her waist and lower rib cage. At the same time, it also looks like she's increased the size of her breasts, so her body looks very unbalanced. These three are compressing their entire torsos, at least from front to back. Of course, their internal organs have compressed to smaller sizes as well. Here's one showing side-to-side compression in the bottom half of the rib cage. So as you can see, they could compress to a very small circumference. These are more extreme examples of torso compression. The one on the left has opened the ribcage and compressed all the way inside, so you can see the inner side of the ribs. The one in the middle has compressed the entire ribcage while keeping it closed. The soft tissue in the abdomen is compressed inside the pelvic bone, and that's the same on all of them. All of the organs have flattened out in there. This must have some negative effect on their functionality, so they wouldn't want to stay in this compressed state for too long. When your heart and lungs are compressed like this, it would certainly reduce your energetic capacity. This one has compressed the abdomen, but left the ribcage at its normal size, so there's a very abrupt drop at that point. You'd never see this on a human body because the abdominal muscles wouldn't collapse like that, nor the internal organs. The arm is showing compression in circumference and length, and the clavicle muscles being reverted. The thigh is being reverted as well, as you can see the inner bone separating. She's compressed her upper arm down to less than 2 inches in diameter, and the lower half of her forearm has become blade-shaped. She's also reverting the bulge at the elbow, and the man on the left is reverting the folds on his neck and cheek. Frequently you'll see shape-shifting on the secondary people in a photo, and they're doing that to let you know that the subject in the photo is also a drac shape-shifting. The one on the left has compressed his legs to about half the circumference of his arms. He's also compressed his lower abdomen, pelvis, and buttocks. On the one on the right, you can tell the original circumference of her legs by the size and shape of the shorts. When she shifts her legs back to their normal sizes, they'll fill out that empty space in the shorts. Also notice that her right lower leg is curved forward, though it doesn't appear to be an ankle reversion.
This male imitation has compressed his legs to extremely short lengths, in addition to the circumference. You can see how tiny he would be if he compressed his entire body like this. You should also be able to recognize that he's reverting his shoulders and elbows.
This one has compressed her thighs in one dimension, front to back, while leaving the length and width unchanged. She's also elongated her left lower leg, and it's developed a forward bend at about the midpoint, possibly an ankle reversion. Here's a before and after showing torso compression and slight reversion in the pelvis. She's also reverting the veins in her abdomen.
This one has compressed all of the soft tissue in her body, so it's nearly down to the skeleton. If she were human, she wouldn't even be able to stand up at this point. In fact, she would have died from organ failure long before this. After this picture was taken, she went somewhere private and decompressed back to her normal human imitation form. These three have compressed their arms down to the point where they basically generate them. It's just a hand attached to the shoulder. The one on the left is demonstrating that his hands are functional, which would be impossible with the human body. You need the muscles in your forearm to motivate your wrist and fingers. They won't work without the structure and length they need to contract properly. The Dracs can do this because in their plasticized forms, Their bodies are not motivated by muscle mechanics. They're using their polymorphic ability to move the tissue around. It simulates muscular action, but it doesn't have the mechanical limitations of a real muscle.
I know that they can compress limbs to ungenerate them because I've seen this in person. Last year I saw a man with a compressed forearm where his hand was basically attached to his elbow. As I walked by, he dangled it at me so I'd see it, and as he walked away, his forearm elongated back to its normal length. Then he looked back at me and nodded. Now you're seeing the same kind of compression on legs, where the feet are attached to the hips. He's also reverting the creases on his neck and the right clavicle muscle, and that's to show that he's a drac, and that what you're looking at is shape-shifting. Officially, they call it a disease, but again, it's actually shape-shifting. It's a drac that's compressed the length of its fingers. The only disease you can call it is lycanthropy, but even then, it's not a disease that you can catch. It's an ability that you're born with and have full control over. Here's another one doing face pulling, and it should be clear that it is physically impossible for a human to do this. You cannot pull your jaw over your nose. What you're looking at is a drac that's compressed the middle of its face. This one's compressed his entire body, but unlike real dwarf types, his body proportions are close to those of a normal person. I have no doubt that he could get even smaller than this, but there's a limit to what they're willing to show. We know he could compress his arms and legs to almost nothing, and then he'd only be about a foot tall. The limiting factor is how much the internal organs could be compressed. As to how this compression takes place at the cellular level, I have no idea. Just that it would involve the alteration of the molecular structure. Every molecule in their bodies is being compressed, and at the same time, the weight decreases with the volume. This appears to violate the law of conservation of mass, but it doesn't, because they're not actually losing molecules. I have personal experience with individuals increasing their weight but not their size, so they can change their perceived weight at will. It's just that it's not sensible for them to walk around in their human imitation forms weighing 600 pounds. Here's another example of full body compression, maybe even slightly smaller than the one before. That's the world's shortest woman with the world's tallest model, and they're both dracs. In their native forms, they're probably about the same size. I doubt that she's an exceptionally small drac in her native form. You're just seeing different levels of compression. If the big one is compressed about 50%, the other one is compressed at least 90%. These two have compressed their torsos and other parts, but not their heads. Once again, the official explanation is Agent Orange deformities. Here's another one with a compressed body and relatively normal head. She's described as having only one limb, her right arm. But looking at this, it's clear that she also has a left arm and both legs, though they're obviously deformed from their normal human imitation forms. Her torso is about the size of a bowling ball, but I think that the organs could be compressed even further. I was looking for an example of one without arms or legs, that had a highly compressed torso with a normal-sized head, but I couldn't find that. Again, you can see shape-shifting on the secondary individual in the photos, the right photo in particular. She's compressed her right forearm and wrist, which look like they're about half the circumference of her left arm. Now we're going to look at decompression or expansion from the human imitation form. The cells and molecules are returning to their original sizes from a compressed state. Like the decompressed vein I showed earlier, it's clear looking at this that it's a very large, perhaps even gigantic creature. It's possible that they can actually expand their bodies beyond the natural size. That may be what we're seeing here. So if that's true, they'd be able to imitate creatures that are larger than themselves. Arm compression next to decompression or expansion, and they can reverse their compression states at any time. He could make his arms look like hers, and vice versa. This is obviously leg decompression or expansion, and the official disease is called Proteus syndrome. Her legs are noticeably longer in the left frame than they are in the middle frame. She's well over 7 feet tall there. So if this is indicative of the native form, 10 feet is certainly possible, maybe even taller. This story ran in the mainstream media, and they are required to show you the truth from time to time. That's what this is about, and this individual, Mandy Sellers, either volunteered or was chosen to do this early in life. They're showing you what they really are, polymorphic aliens, but they tell you it's a disease. It's up to you to use your ability to reason to determine what you're really looking at. In the left frame, she's reverting the knuckles of her right hand to show you that she's a drac. She's also reverting the curvature in her left forearm. In the right frame, she's reverting some of the veins in her forearms. Part of her left leg has supposedly been amputated at this point, but the reality is she just compressed and ungenerated that part. In Greek mythology, the god Proteus is a shapeshifter, so Proteus syndrome is actually an appropriate name. This was officially caused by a tumor, but you're an idiot if you believe that. What kind of tumor causes your leg to double in length? Cancer is actually a fungal infection of Candida albicans, and tumors are cysts created by your body to enclose the colonies and prevent them from spreading. If you're that badly infected, you would have died long before this. The logical explanation is that it's shape-shifting. This is a drac that's decompressed or expanded its left leg to twice the length and 3 to 4 times the circumference of its normal human size. It looks like it belongs on an elephant. Apply this size increase to an entire body, and you can see how big they can get, and they can likely get even bigger than that. The official explanation is that it's caused by blocked lymph nodes. Right. That must be what caused the bones in her hands to double in size. She's also removed most of the texture from the skin on her arms, so it looks like it's made out of plastic. Decompression in the right arm, with the forearm and hand deformed from their normal human imitation forms. The cobra tattoo is there to let you know that he's a reptilian. Of course, it's not a real tattoo. He's generating that color in his skin using his polymorphic ability, and he could remove it instantly at any time. Here's another example of decompressed or expanded hands, and he's generated a sixth finger on his right hand. In the right frame, you can also see that he's morphed his chest into a deformed shape. Head decompression, and once again, the official explanation is Proteus syndrome. His head looks bigger in the left frame because the other man has compressed his head. You can tell that it's smaller than normal in comparison to the size of his hands. He's also reverting the tendon in the side of his neck. Decompression or expansion in the left deltoid and part of the upper arm, with an abrupt angular transition at the midpoint. He could do this with his entire body and turn into the Hulk. The official explanation is Agent Orange. Decompression or expansion with the shape change to simulate increased muscularity. He's decompressed his upper arms and trapezius muscles, but the rest of his body hasn't changed much. The official explanation is that he's injecting synthol oil into his muscles. Note the dragon tattoo, which tells you what he really is. Again, upper arms and traps only. He's reverting his left forehead horn and the creases on his neck to show that he's a drac. Their arms are much longer than this in their native forms, so this may represent an equivalent volume on a longer, narrower arm. It's also possible that their arms are this big around. He's decompressed his muscles and generated irregular shapes. His pectoralis muscles look more like breasts, and his right trapezius muscle is formed into a square shape. In the left frame, he's compressed his right hand and wrist to show that he's shape-shifting. Again, these are not real muscles. It's plasticized tissue motivated by their polymorphic ability. Presumably, when they revert to their native forms, the muscles function naturally. Both of these individuals are exhibiting skeletal expansion in their shoulders. That's why their arms hang so far out to the sides. No matter how big your muscles get, they're not going to move your shoulder joints further out. The one on the left is reverting the lateral veins in his triceps and forearms, and the one on the right is reverting his right wrist so that it bends inward. His abdominal muscles are also far out of alignment, where the top right muscle is basically missing. It's the same thing with this guy. His skeleton has widened across the shoulders, where the arms hang further out than they normally would. His arms and abdomen have also elongated, and the circumference of his neck is clearly increased in relation to the chest. This shows that their human imitation muscles are just shapes generated from polymorphic tissue. The one on the right has reformed his abdominal muscles into large flat squares and pushed them out to the sides. These obviously aren't real muscles. The one on the left has generated the shapes of abdominal muscles over what would ordinarily be a fat belly. So the only difference between fat and muscle in their plasticized forms is the shape and firmness. It's all the same gelatin-like polymorphic tissue, just molded into different shapes to imitate human muscles and fat.
These two have reformed their buttocks into non-human shapes. Human muscles would never look like this, no matter how much weightlifting and steroid taking you do. The one on the left has also morphed his back out of its human imitation form.
This looks similar to the back reversion I showed earlier. I think that's the hump coming out. Here are some female imitations that have generated large muscle forms. It has nothing to do with lifting weights and taking steroids. They're just generating shapes from the tissue using their polymorphic ability. And they could generate bodies that look exactly like the male imitations. That's what this one has done. She's generated a male physique without changing her original facial code. So she doesn't have masculine facial features like other female bodybuilders. It looks like a woman's head on a man's body. And a male imitation could do the same. He could change his body to a female imitation code, and then it'd look like a man's head on a woman's body. As I've shown, it's not a male or female. It's a hermaphrodite that's taken a form that looks like a male or female body, with the sex organs rearranged. They're rearranging their sex organs and generating body shapes to imitate one gender or the other. They could generate a human imitation form that's half male and half female, split down the middle. They would have functional male organs and functional female organs. Some of them have done this in the past, working in freak shows, Bobby Cork being one example here. They don't do this anymore because it'd be too obvious that something unnatural is taking place.
They can generate body types that are gradients between the male and female imitation forms. This doesn't happen with humans. All of these transsexuals are Dracs. This one has a body that's at least 80% female, and a face that's entirely female, yet he has male genitals. So it either started out as a female imitation that switched its genitals, or was a male imitation that generated a female body and face. Whatever the case, it's definitely not a standard imitation code that they start with.
This is no different from them shaping their muscles. The official explanation is implants, but that's obviously not possible. It's the same gelatin-like polymorphic tissue molded into shapes to imitate the features of a human body. His muscles are made out of the same kind of polymorphic tissue as their breasts, and they can change the firmness of the tissue at any time, make it harder or softer. So they could make their breasts as hard as muscle, or even harder. And he could make his muscles soft and flaccid, or rubbery to the point where they bounce. Again, it's the same shape generation and decompression, just on different parts of the body.
These two have generated overblown physiques with ridiculous proportions, their muscles and breasts. The blonde appears to have oil on her body, which she's probably generating color and reflectivity in the skin to make it look that way. The other one is reverting her pelvic plates, which have more well-defined edges than the previous examples we've seen. She's also reverting some of the veins in her arm. It looks like they have doll heads, which would make most people think it's photoshopped, but that's shape-shifting too. They've reduced the complexity of their faces, the skin texture and hair, so they look like they're made of plastic. That's why the blonde is wearing that giant crucifix earring. She's letting me know that all of this is shape-shifting, that it's all real.
As you know, they don't have buttocks in their native forms, so they have to generate shapes on the back of the pelvis to imitate human buttocks. This one has generated perfectly spherical shapes to make this obvious. Again, shape-shifting, not implants. These three have generated egg-shaped buttocks with some angularities. The one in the middle has also generated a large growth on the inner side of her left calf. Again, these are just shapes generated from that gelatin-like polymorphic tissue. It's not real fat. The only difference between their imitation muscles and fat is the shape and firmness. By changing the shape and firmness of the tissue, they can instantly turn the appearance of a fat body into the appearance of a muscular body, and vice versa. They can also generate the shapes of muscles, but make them soft and flaccid, like fat, and vice versa. A muscular man that feels like he's made of fat, and a fat man that feels like he's made of muscle. I'll show some demonstrations of this next. This is a shot of Arnold's right pec from Terminator 2. It has the shape of a human pectoralis muscle, but he's reduced the firmness so it behaves more like fat, soft and compressible. This is Jeff Goldblum in The Fly, and he's demonstrating the same thing with this muscle in his back. Now it's Sandal in Hell Comes to Frogtown. She's reduced the firmness of the tissue in her arms, so they flop around like they're made of gelatin. She's going to move her breasts around as if they were muscles, but this motion is not produced by real muscular action. She's using her polymorphic ability to move the cells around, and they can do this with any part of their bodies.
These are shots of her from other videos where she's showing reversions. She's reverting her lateral neck creases in the left and right frames, and one of her front neck cords in the middle frame. She's doing this to show that she's a drac, which explains what's going on in the video.
They can generate angular shapes and flat surfaces from their bodies, which is what you're seeing here. The bodybuilder's right calf is angular. Master Antonio's head is angular and flat along the sides, and Kim Bubs' fingers are angular and flat. They could form their entire bodies into angular shapes and flat surfaces, so they could make themselves look like box robots if they wanted to.
The official explanation is injections, but you know better now. Shape-shifting, not implants. A can-shaped buttock and an egg-shaped buttock. As I said, any part of their bodies. This is Hugh Bailey, the human pretzel. As it turns out, not human at all. But it does show the ridiculous shapes they can mold their bodies into. Look at his right arm. It has angularities, flat surfaces, and it spirals. There's no way you'd be able to use that arm based on muscle mechanics. But he has no problem, because his body doesn't rely on muscle mechanics. It's motivated entirely by his polymorphic ability, which allows him to move the cells around in any direction, free of the constraints of muscles and bones.
This is him in the movie The Mutations, also known as the Freak Maker. He morphs his hands, arms, and legs throughout these clips, and I've slowed those parts down so it's easier to see the changes.
You can see here that his right lower leg has the native ankle joint, except that it's bent in the reverse direction. That makes it look like it's his knee, but his knee is actually up at the pants edge. I showed these two earlier, and they have the same kind of bent lower leg, so I'm quite certain that those are their native ankle joints in reverse. As you'll see later, they can bend their knees in reverse, so it's not surprising that they can do the same with their ankle joints. Again, it's possible that they're bending the bones, but judging by the way Hugh moves, it looks like a joint to me. Did you catch the shape-shifting in that clip? In the left frame, which comes earlier, you can see that his ring and pinky fingers have moved closer together and become much thinner than normal, as they've started to meld together. In the right frame, they've completely melded together to form a single finger,
so he has only 4 fingers on his left hand now. This proves that Hugh is a Drac, and that the rest of his body is the result of shapeshifting, not some birth defect. He could morph his body into far more exaggerated shapes than this, but as I said, there's a limit to what they're willing or permitted to show. In Hugh's case, I think he'd be willing to show just about anything, but if he went any further, they would have killed him before he got the chance to show it. Again, this is Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio in the Abyss. She's showing a fairly deep reversion in the left frame, the reptilian eye, mouth, and center forehead ridge, as you saw before. The right frame occurs 2 seconds later in the shot, where her face is already returning to its human imitation form. The center ridge is gone for the most part, and her human nose is beginning to take shape. In the second shot here, she's morphed her features into crude, incomplete forms. Her nose is shaped like a block, her mouth is little more than a slit, and her eyes are angular and flat. I doubt that you could see with their eyes in that state, but again, I suppose anything is possible with their supernatural biology. In this last shot of the sequence, she's morphing her face in its human imitation form. You can see that her left nostril is split open in the right frame. A plate-like edge is formed over her left cheek in the left frame. In the right frame, a lump is formed on her right cheek, and her right eye is turned into a black hole. These two have reduced the complexity of their faces and generated cartoonish features. The one on the left has ungenerated his eyebrows and eyelashes, reduced the size of his irides, and removed most of the skin texture and the normal coloration from his upper lip. You can also see that he's reverting the depressed area at the base of his neck, which confirms that he's a Drac and that all of this is shape-shifting. The one on the right has removed all of the texture from the skin, increased the size of the eyes, and reduced the nose and mouth. They could all reduce the complexity of their bodies to make themselves look like plastic dolls or 3D computer models. That's what this one's done. He's reduced the complexity of his body, the shape and texture, so that he looks like a doll or 3D computer model. The official explanation is that he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on surgery to make himself look like a freak. You're an idiot if you believe that. Angelina and the male imitation on the left have removed most of the texture from their skin. They've also increased the reflectivity to make it shine like plastic. They could increase the reflectivity even further to make it as shiny as metal, and you'll see an example of that later.
This one has generated pieces of skin peeling off, but it's not actually dead. I've seen this in person on a male imitation whose skin looked normal, and then a few hours later was peeling, and then back to normal again a short time after. Also notice that the ears partially melded into the head. That's to let you know that it's all shape-shifting.
This almost looks like a 3D computer model, and someone added a blurred transition on the left side to make it look that way, but it is real. It's removed all of the texture from its skin and generated plastic reflectivity. It's obviously decompressed its legs and buttocks, and it's reduced the shape complexity of its entire body. It also appears to be reverting the chest bulge. You've already seen a number of examples that demonstrate that all of this is possible. She's reduced the tautness of the skin and generated folds and creases where there shouldn't be any. It has nothing to do with sunburn. It's all shape-shifting, including the skin color change. And the child imitation is sticking out his tongue to let you know that they're Dracs. These individuals have reduced the tautness of their skin while increasing the thickness, so it forms into heavy folds. The ones showing their torsos have also reduced the texture of the skin, which makes it look like they're wearing rubber suits. But it is their skin. The official explanation is that this is caused by a rare type of fungal infection. No, that's stupid. This would never happen to human skin. It's obviously shape-shifting. And I've seen this in person, so I know it's real. They can make themselves look like walking trees. I spoke to a Drac recently, a female imitation, who confirmed that they can all generate this bark skin. They all have this code in their cells. She said that they all have the ability to morph into plant imitation forms, and I've seen it myself. Of course, they're not actually turning into plants. It's shape, texture, color, and hardness generated to resemble bark, but it's not really plant matter. The cells in there are always reptilian. The official explanation is tumors. Nearly every human that looks at this accepts that explanation. They're failing IQ tests every moment of their lives. Dracs can generate skin that looks like bark, so generating bubbles is no problem. How do you breathe and eat with the solid mass of tissue covering your nose and mouth? If you're human, you don't. You asphyxiate and die. But if you're a Drac, you can generate a channel through the tissue which allows you to breathe. When you need to eat, you morph your face back to its normal human imitation form, and when you're done, you morph it back to its altered state, which remains perfectly accurate in the cellular code. They can decompress or expand specific areas of their bodies. That's what you're seeing here. The one on the left decompressed or expanded the cells in his lips and in those bumps on his face. And the one on the right decompressed or expanded the cells on the left side of his face and the top of his head. The official explanation for this one is tumors. Symmetrical tumors. Right. That must have also caused his mouth to change into a non-human form and his skin to turn reddish. He's trying to generate the facial appearance of a boar with a body that looks like it's made out of molten rocks. They can generate any shape, texture, and color from their skin. They can change its thickness, hardness, elasticity, tautness, and reflectivity. They can make it look and feel like any kind of animal hide, tree bark, stone, plastic, metal, and of course human skin, complete with fingerprints. They tell you that you're looking at diseases and tumors, but to any marginally intelligent person, it should be obvious that there's something supernatural going on here. Their hairs are also shapes generated from the skin, same as the other shapes, just formed into fibers instead of bubbles or bark. This is Britney Spears on generating the fibers on the back of her head, where the cells have liquefied and melted together into a solid plasticized mass. Those fibers are basically reverting to their natural state as skin cells. She could regenerate them in an instant, and those liquefied cells would reform into hairs, the same length and color as before. These three have melded the fibers together towards the bottom, forming a solid mass, and it's too long to be real hair. The stress would cause it to break off before it reached that length. Just think of it as a long piece of skin hanging off the head. That's what you're looking at. These three have generated extremely large volumes of hair, and they've accomplished this by decompressing each fiber. So the total number of fibers hasn't changed, not much anyway. It's that each individual fiber has become much larger. You can see that most clearly with the one on the left. Just like the other skin morphing we've seen, they can form these fibers into any shape, even into formations that defy gravity. They could have their hair sticking straight out to the side, 5 feet or more. They're using their polymorphic ability to maintain that position, but it almost certainly uses up energy when they do that. Just as we saw in Britney, the guy on the left has largely plasticized his hair, where the fibers have melded together into a solid mass. This is also shape-shifting. Just like the fibers on their heads, these are generated from skin cells. They can curl and uncurl these fibers in an instant just by thinking it. The guy on the right could make his beard move like tentacles and even grab objects, but that's not something they'd show in public. They can generate these fibers anywhere on their bodies, even in places where humans don't have hair follicles, like the palms of the hands. This allows them to imitate creatures with fur. And I know that this is true because I've personally seen them in werewolf forms. The one at the top left has generated straight head-type hair on her face, and the one below has generated very long, straight fibers from her upper eyelids. Once again, she's sticking her tongue out to let you know that she's a drac. As I showed in my last video, the V sign means that they're dracs. though I'm not sure what it represents exactly about them. Whatever it is, it doesn't mean peace or victory. In some cultures where this sign is popular in the mainstream media, like Japan, you may get a few humans doing it, but the Dracs are definitely the origin. They're all demonstrating increased skin elasticity. You can't do this with human skin. The guy in the middle right frame is also showing increased elasticity with the tissue inside his cheeks. And the guy in the bottom right frame has ungenerated his left eyelids, so his eyeball is exposed, just sitting in a hole. This guy has pulled the skin from his neck all the way up to his hairline. I had a quote-unquote friend in middle school who one time pulled the skin out from his neck at least 6 inches on each side. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I do remember it. Now that I recognize it, I remember him doing a lot of shape-shifting. This one has generated thick flaps of skin on his forehead and face, and he's increased the elasticity of the tissue to make it sag. His nose and mouth are deformed as well. This one has increased the tissue elasticity in the left side of his face, causing it to sag below his chin, while generating bumps on the right side of his face. In the right frame you can see that his ear is dropped down to his neck, and it looks like melted plastic, which it basically is. In the middle frame, he's demonstrating the rubbery nature of the tissue. This one has sagged the left side of his face down to his chest. He's also generated small bumps in the skin. The official explanation for this is elephantiasis, another fake disease. The real explanation is shape-shifting. This one has sagged the right side of his face even further down, generating a very large mass of tissue. In the left frame you can see how depressed he is to have this horrible deformity, and how he doesn't want to have his picture taken. To them it doesn't matter what they look like in their human imitation forms. Fat, ugly, deformed. They know it's just a costume they wear to fool humans. However, when they start deforming their costumes too much, they risk breaking the masquerade, which may get them killed. But in terms of their personal estimation of human beauty, they don't care at all. This one has sagged and decompressed all of the soft tissue in his face. It's to the point of being comical. Even his mouth has sagged to a much lower position, which likely means that the skull has elongated as well. He's also missing his ears. The official explanation is that a tumor caused this. You have to be an abject moron to believe that, and apparently most humans are. That's some tumor that causes your head to turn into Jabba the Hutt. Sagging eyes, noses, and mouths. It's a living plastic doll that had one side of its face melted, which deformed and sagged, and then solidified in its new form. That's what you're looking at. Living alien plastic that can liquefy, change shape, and solidify again. Skin, muscle, and bone, every cell in their bodies. These two are primarily expanding and sagging the tissue around their eyes. It looks like they've ungenerated those eyes, otherwise there'd be giant eyeballs in there. Those are the eyelids in the right frame, so you can see how big the eyeball would be if it were present. This one is generating both bumps and sag. Also notice that she's reduced the length of the fingers on her right hand, so she's leaving no doubt that it's all shape-shifting. Again, the official explanation is tumors, which is laughable. Her skin is decidedly greenish in these photos. How many humans saw this and actually questioned what they were looking at? I admire the Dracs that are willing to do this, but they must also wonder if it's worth helping a race that can't see the truth when it's right in front of them. She's sagged the left side of her face, and also notice that her hair is plasticized on that side. The fibers have melded together and formed into a solid mass that looks like it's made of plastic. That's the same thing I showed earlier with the guy on the left. In other versions of this photo, that side of her hair has been completely blacked out, so you don't see that. This is the only one I've found that hasn't been altered. He's generated thick overlapping folds on his face, and one that covers the top of his head. You've seen how many different appearances they can create, and these are only based on their human imitation forms. They could also change the basic forms of their bodies to create an almost infinite number of appearances. This one has sagged her entire face, generating a long piece on the right side. She's also ungenerated her eyes, or at least compressed them to a much smaller size. They may still be in the sockets, just hidden behind the skin. How she got the skin over the sockets is by melting the eyelids together, and they can all do this spontaneously. This one has completely ungenerated her human imitation face, including the eyes, and she sagged a large mass of tissue down to her chest. She doesn't have an identifiable nose or mouth, and there's no indication of eye sockets either. It's not recognizable as a human face at all. Again, when she has to eat, she morphs her face, or at least her mouth, back to its normal human imitation form. And when she's done, she shifts back to this state. Notice in the left frame that her mother is generating small bumps all over her face. That's also shape-shifting, and it's meant to show you that they're both Dracs, and that her daughter is shape-shifting as well. These two have sagged the tissue in their faces down to their chests, liquefied the skin cells, and melded them together. They can meld any part of their bodies together like this: eyelids, lips, teeth, fingers, toes, and even legs. The official explanations for these are fire and acid burns, but fire and acid don't cause your skin to sag and meld into other parts of your body. The cells would just die and fall off, or be eaten away, and your body isn't going to create scar tissue like this. You can also see that they're reverting some of the cords and tendons in their necks. Here are two more shape-shifting under the pretense of being burn victims. The one on the left has reduced the entire face to a crude state, and also increased the reflectivity of the skin so it looks like plastic. In addition to sagging and melding the skin from the face, the one on the right has also melded the left arm to the torso. You can also see that the bottom row of teeth have turned out to the front, and that they've morphed into sharp points. I'll show more examples of teeth morphing later. Here are two examples of sagging tissue on the body. The one on the left is called disease, neurofibromatosis, and the one on the right is called fat. But they're actually the same thing, just on different parts of the body. It's tissue decompression or expansion combined with increased elasticity. That's how they create this sagging flesh. This is an example of cellular liquefaction and increased elasticity applied to all of the soft tissue in a body. It looks like it's melting, and in effect, it is. This individual has switched the cells to a semi-fluid state, increased the elasticity, and allowed gravity to take effect. The result is what appears to be a human body melting into a puddle of tissue. He or she could take it further by liquefying the bones, which would cause the entire body to flatten out. But in that case, it wouldn't look like a real body anymore, so that would defeat the purpose of the demonstration. This photo shows up in memes, but when you know what it really is, it's not funny anymore. The point of many memes is to show people images of shapeshifting, but they do it under the guise of humor. These photos were supposedly taken in 1905, showing a female imitation with liquefied bones in her arms and legs. The official disease is called osteomalacia, which means soft bones, but it sounds more impressive in Latin. Her arms and legs are in different poses between the photos, so it's clear that the bones are soft and flexible, not just deformed over time. If you were to bend her arms and legs, they'd probably feel like they were made of rubber. There are only two ways that she could have been reposed. Someone else moved her arms and legs, or she moved them herself. Most likely, she moved them herself. As we saw with Hugh Bailey, their plasticized forms are not motivated by muscle mechanics. They're using their polymorphic ability to move the cells around, so they don't need rigid bones with muscles contracting to produce movement. Using her polymorphic ability, she'd be able to move her floppy limbs around like tentacles, bending and twisting them in any direction. It's unlikely that she could stand up in this state with no rigidity in her legs, but she would be able to crawl on all fours. In the left frame, you can tell that her right lower leg is much longer than quote-unquote normal, even bent as it is, and she's morphed her right upper arm into a flat, rectangular shape, which is different from the right frame, so that's clearly identified as shapeshifting. Her left hand is elongated in both photos, and it appears that she's ungenerated her vagina. So there's more going on here than just soft bones. After these photos were taken, she straightened out her arms and legs, morphed the rest of her body back to normal, switched the bone cells back to the solid state, stood up, and walked out. Needless to say, I have a great deal of respect for this individual. Here are two more demonstrating bone liquefaction. In addition to bending and twisting, their bones would also stretch when pulled. So in the semi-fluid state, their bones behave much like rubber. They can simulate injuries in this way, by bending the bones to make it look like they're broken. At first glance, you think her body is bent at the waist, but you can see that it's actually her ribcage that's bent. The lower half of the ribcage is in line with the abdomen, going forward at about a 45-degree angle with the floor. The upper half of the ribcage slants backward at about a 45-degree angle with the floor. So the upper half of the ribcage is bent back about 90 degrees from the lower half. She liquefied the bone cells in that part of her ribcage so that the motion would bend it. You can also see that she's morphing her left hand and forearm, showing the elbow bulge and bent back thumb. These two are showing the flexibility of their plasticized bodies. They can morph their spines and then bend them backwards. They could fold their bodies in half, but there's a limit to what they're willing or permitted to show. They can morph their hip joints and then bend or rotate them in any direction, at least 90 degrees from the standing position. She's accomplished this by rotating her pelvis 90 degrees backwards, and you can tell that it's absolutely effortless for her. She's also reverting the middle knuckles of her left hand to show that she's a drac. They can morph their finger joints and then bend or rotate them in any direction, at least 90 degrees from the aligned position, pointed straight out from the hand. I frequently see the bent back thumb, but I don't see other fingers bent too often, as Denzel Washington is showing here. They're able to hold objects with the joints of their fingers bent backwards. That's what you're seeing here. You can't do this with a human hand. Even if you force the joints into those positions, the muscles wouldn't have any grip strength to hold on. But they can do this because their bodies are motivated by their polymorphic ability. They can morph their knees and then bend or rotate them in any direction, at least 90 degrees from the standing position. The official explanation is that these are people with hyperextended knees, but looking at this, that's clearly not the case. Human muscles don't allow for reverse leg movements like this, and they simply can't bend to this extent because the patellae would interfere. None of these individuals have patellae. They've ungenerated them so that they're able to walk with their knees backwards. In a human body, the quadriceps muscles are attached to the patella, so without that, they won't work at all. Once again, this shows that their bodies don't function through muscle mechanics. The muscles in the thigh are only capable of contracting and extending to a certain point. The quadriceps are basically fully contracted when the leg is extended straight out. They can't overcontract to cause the knee to bend in the reverse direction. And the same is true of the hamstrings in terms of extension. Also notice that the boy in the middle frame and the girl in the top right frame have the same torso curvature that I showed earlier in the reversion section. Look at the agility this child imitation displays here. Not only is he not hindered by this, he's far more agile than any human with normal legs. He's also morphing his arms to accomplish this. The only thing he wouldn't be able to do is run fast. This one is demonstrating ankle and knee rotation, as he's able to turn his feet almost completely backwards. Some of the turn is in the knees, and the rest is in the hips and ankles, which adds up to about 180 degrees. The thighs are rotated about 90 degrees to the outside, and the lower legs are rotated about 90 degrees from the thighs. The ankles aren't rotated at all. They can morph their shoulder and elbow joints, and then bend or rotate them in any direction, at least 90 degrees from the arms straight out to the sides. The one on the left has rotated his shoulder joints 180 degrees laterally from the lowered position. Presumably he rotated them inward. The one in the middle has rotated his shoulder joint 180 degrees vertically from the lowered position, obviously going backwards. The one on the right has bent her right elbow backwards at about a 45-degree angle. They can morph the vertebrae at their necks and rotate their heads almost 180 degrees laterally. Maybe more, but that's as far as they're willing to show. Here's the video that's the source of that frame. Also notice that he decompresses his head somewhat when it's facing backwards. Here's a demonstration of shoulder morphing flexibility. Now he's elongating his torso and neck. He's morphing the vertebrae in his back so that he's able to rotate the upper half of his body backwards from the lower half, and he can walk like that. There's the head decompression on the left, and the other one is reverting his right hand and arm. Even in motion, it's clear that the right hand is much larger than the left. Here's another flexibility and shape-shifting video. He starts out with his spine reverted to its natural curvature, the same forward slanted abdomen and back slanted ribcage that you saw earlier in the reversion section. His head is facing forward and his feet are facing backward, so his spine is twisted nearly 180 degrees. He reverts the curvature of his spine again. He's folded his spine in half, so that the back of his head is below his buttocks. If you think it's possible for a human to do this, you're a moron. If this were a human body, the back would be broken, and the abdominal muscles would also be torn. All of the contortionists are Dracs. That's why they can do these things. Looking at these frames, you can see that his cranium elongates as he folds backwards. We know that's a reversion to the native form, which proves that he's a Drac. This one is mostly reversions. He's reverting his abdomen and lower rib cage. Now he's repeatedly reverting and shifting his shoulders back to the human imitation form. He's repeatedly reverting and shifting back his abdomen and rib cage, with the bottom of the rib cage bulging out, just as we saw in the reversion section. Now he's compressing his rib cage to a smaller circumference. He's repeatedly reverting and shifting back his scapulae. If you did this with human knees, all the ligaments would snap. The one on the left has expanded the bottom half of her head to cartoonish proportions, having the appearance of a hippo's mouth. Her original human imitation teeth are positioned on the right side of her mouth, so it looks like most of the expansion has taken place to the left side, though there are a few teeth over there as well. She's another one that looks so depressed to have this terrible deformity and clearly doesn't want to have her picture taken. And right after this, she morphed her face back to its normal human imitation form. The one on the right has also expanded the area around her mouth, but this was a permanent change that she made early in life. Permanent in the sense that she had to consistently look like this when she was in public. Again, they have no personal interest in human beauty. It doesn't matter to them what they look like in their human imitation forms, only that it serves its purpose as a disguise. Obvious jaw decompression or expansion, once again under the guise of a tumor. Her mouth is stretched out like it's made of rubber, as she's increased the elasticity of the tissue. In the photo on the left, you can see the creases forming in her neck, which confirms that she's a drac.
Here's another one that shows the lifelong alteration. In the photo on the right, she's generated extremely high reflectivity on the left side of her face, so that it shines like metal. They may be able to generate even higher reflectivity, up to that of a mirror, but I haven't seen that yet. In the middle frame, she's making the V sign to let you know what she really is.
Obvious tongue decompression or expansion, and the area around his mouth has come forward from the rest of his face. This one has drastically altered the structure of its human imitation face. The mouth is stretched upward in the middle into a triangular shape, and all that's left of the nose are the nostril holes, which have moved to a higher position above the eyes. The eyes have moved very far apart, out to the sides, and it looks like she's either ungenerated the eyeballs or they've turned red. Look at the moving hand in the middle frame. You can see talons forming on the middle and ring fingers. Like the other secondary shapeshifting we've seen, the purpose is to let you know that the main subject is also a drac shapeshifting. These are also shapeshifting under the guise of tumors. They've just morphed their faces into ball shapes. When they have the quote-unquote tumors removed, all they do is morph their faces back to their normal human imitation forms. There is no surgery. It's all shapeshifting. This one has generated the same kind of facial structure, but a more extreme version. She's turned the middle of her face into a ball, and her eyes have moved completely out to the sides where they bulge out from the sockets, like a frog's eyes. This is a radical change from a human skull, to have the eye sockets on the sides of the head. No tumor is going to do that. These two have expanded their faces far out to the front, the one on the left resembling a bird's beak, and the one on the right resembling a hippo's snout. You can also see reversions here. The one on the left has an elongated cranium, and the one on the right has a long, flat forearm and rounded elbow. They're showing you that they're dracs. The official cause is a tumor, which is nonsense. Notice that his right eye is either pushed out of the socket or the socket is moved and turned up, which would involve drastic changes in the skull. Either way, it's obvious that a tumor didn't do this. This one has expanded his head out to the side, including the eye. He's removed almost all of the texture from the skin and increased the reflectivity so that it has that plastic shine. Two more Dracs that have morphed their faces into disfigurations from their human imitation forms. With the one on the left, you can see that the pores are just empty craters. They don't contain sebaceous glands. That's one of the ways to identify them, which I'll discuss in more detail later. The one on the left has reduced his jaw to a simple form, and the one on the right has ungenerated his nose and reduced the complexity of his entire face. It looks more like a ball with eyes and a mouth than a human face. More facial alterations, and the one on the right is also reverting his cranium. I'm sure you've noticed that most of these photos of disease shapeshifting come from Asia, primarily China and India. For some reason, the establishment there is more tolerant of this. The Drac rulership in China have always made themselves prominent in Chinese culture, having dragons and symbols in mythology. They must want humans to know this to some extent, or at least give them the opportunity to know it. They can expand specific areas of their bodies and push out the tissue to create a bulge, and they can do the reverse. They can compress specific areas and pull the tissue inward to create concavities anywhere in their bodies. The only limitation is that it may begin to interfere with the function of the internal organs if they're highly compressed or deformed. The guy on the left obviously had to compress his brain a fair amount, and the one on the right, his lungs, and maybe his heart. As I said, heart and lung compression must reduce their energetic capacity, but I'm not sure if brain compression reduces their intelligence. I suppose it's possible that they're dumber in their human imitation forms. Green skin is always a giveaway that you're looking at shapeshifting. The one on the left has ungenerated his human nose and left a hole in its place. It also looks like he's reverting the scales of the native form. The one on the right has drastically altered its human appearance into something that looks more reptilian. It's ungenerated its nose, expanded its mouth, and changed the shape and orientation of its eyes. That structure protruding from its forehead may be part of the center ridge, only partially reverted. The skin has become coarse and leathery, and the only parts that still look human are the neck and right hand. This is shapeshifting captured on Google Maps. This individual knew that the vehicle was coming to take pictures, so he or she morphed into this form right before it got there, and then morphed back to the human imitation form after the picture was taken. The head is either decompressed from its human imitation size, or the body is compressed, or perhaps a combination of both. The skin is turned completely green as well. A short time after this was noticed, Google blurred out the individual, which you can see in the right frame. Later, they blurred out the entire house. As I said, some of the photos used for memes are actually shape-shifting, and that's the point of using them for memes, to increase the visibility of shape-shifting in the mainstream. Most people probably don't make anything of it, but some may begin to catch on that something isn't right. These two appear in memes, and this is shape-shifting. That's also a clear example of neck elongation on the right. It's the same with these two. Shape-shifting used in memes, under the guise of humor. That's nose reduction on the left, and nose decompression or expansion on the right. They've also reduced the complexity of their teeth and gums, and the one on the right has generated hair on her forehead, below the normal hairline. Even though you may think it's photoshopped at first glance, the one on the left is shape-shifting. In addition to the nose, her left eye is moved to a lower position, where it's far out of alignment with the right. She's also reverting the center forehead ridge, and creases have formed over her right eyelid. Again, in the middle photo, you can see that those aren't real pores on his nose. They're just empty craters. The one on the right is classified as Treacher-Collins syndrome, but it's also shape-shifting. Here are more quote-unquote funny faces that are actually shape-shifting. The one on the right is vertical compression between the eyes and mouth, and he's also reverting the forward neck slant and tendon, and the extra lip as well. The one in the middle is front-to-back jaw compression and vertical elongation between the eyes and mouth. The two on the left have formed their mouths into shapes that aren't possible with human muscles. They're using their polymorphic ability to create those shapes, molding their cells like clay or putty. They could form their mouths into any shape they want to. It's just a question of what's acceptable to show in public. The one on the right is lip and nose enlargement, and she's also reverting the center forehead ridge. The one in the middle is eye and mouth enlargement, and she's also reverting the creases on her jaw and neck. The one on the left is lateral compression in the left side of the skull, and deformation in the shape of the mouth. Shape-shifting on hands, feet, and legs, officially called elephantiasis. The discovery of this so-called disease originates from Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. Of course, Joseph Merrick was a drac, and the whole point was to set up this fake disease to explain all of the shape-shifting people would be seeing in the future. The explanation for the photo on the left is rheumatoid arthritis, which is ridiculous. The individual on the right has melded the middle and ring fingers together into a single finger, and then melded the skin between the fingers. So it's 3 fingers joined together by the skin. The official name for this type of shape-shifting is Apert syndrome. These individuals have morphed their hands into claw-like forms. The two on the right have essentially split their hands apart with 2 fingers on each side, and the ones on the left have gone a step further, reducing to 2 opposing digits, resembling a lobster's claw. As you know, they have 3 fingers in their native forms, so this is actually simpler for them to generate than a human hand. You can find this type of shapeshifting under the terms cleft hands or lobster claw syndrome. The one on the left is walking on the sides of the feet. The feet have been rotated inward and pads have been generated below to provide stability. The individual on the right has expanded a large mass of tissue from the tops and sides of the feet, extending up the legs. Vintage shapeshifting, probably classified as elephantiasis. The one in the middle has expanded the left lower leg into a giant ball, and as you know, they can do this with any part of their bodies. This also shows that they can assume much larger sizes than their human imitation forms. This is from a Bojangles commercial, and I believe that we're looking at actual shapeshifting here. This guy has reformed his hands into imitations of human feet. He already has the imitation code for human feet, so he just imprint that to the cells in his hands, and then he could morph them into feet. As I've said a number of times, their plasticized forms are motivated by their polymorphic ability, not by muscle mechanics. It's not really a foot. It's a plasticized form that has the shape of a foot, that can be externally functional without the bones and muscles of a real foot. So they could have functional feet for hands, or hands for feet, or hands on their shoulders, as you've seen before. The other actor has morphed his hand to 4 fingers, as it looks like the middle and ring fingers have melded together. Once again, I think that this secondary shapeshifting confirms that the other actor is shapeshifting, that he really has generated feet for hands. Alterations in the neck and upper chest. From left to right, the official explanations are neurofibromatosis, tumor, tumor. In the right frame, notice that his head and neck are shifted off center to his left side. He's also reverting the folds on his abdomen. Alterations in the back. The official explanations are tumor on the left and an overgrown mole on the right. An overgrown mole. The one on the left is also reverting the length of his neck, which is somewhat disguised by the camera angle. He's showing you that he's a drac, so you know that thing on its back is shapeshifting. These 3 have generated branch-like formations from their heads. As you've seen with the bark skin, and I've seen in person, I know that this is possible. They can assume forms that look like walking trees, complete with branches and leaves. The one on the right supposedly had this nose grafted onto his forehead. No, he generated it with his polymorphic ability. He could spontaneously generate extra noses or ears anywhere on his body. That's because they're just shapes molded from the skin, no different than the bubbles and fibers. Unlike human noses and ears, they're not based on cartilage. That's another way to identify them, by the lack of cartilage in their noses and ears. The one on the left has generated a penis-like formation on his forehead, which even has visible veins. However, it's too far away to be connected to the reproductive and urinary organs, so it wouldn't be functional. Their polymorphic ability is remarkable, but I doubt they could reroute the urethra all the way up to the head. This is a supposed face transplant, with the before and after on the right. In the before state, his eyes and nose are ungenerated, with skin over the sockets, and not even a hole where his nose used to be. He doesn't really have any lips either. Yet in the after photo, his face looks reasonably normal, except for his mouth being crooked. He has a nose and lips, and the shape of his face has changed, as have his hair type and hairline. It also appears that he has eyes behind the sunglasses, visible on the left side at least. Do you really believe it's possible for surgery to turn what is basically a blank skull into a reasonable facsimile of a human face? Apparently millions of humans do, which tells you why the Dracs are able to control us so easily. In the photo on the left, he's reverting that elongated cranium, so that confirms that he's a Drac. He received a new imitation code and then generated that after face. No surgery necessary, and he did it in an instant. Here's another one that received a miraculous face transplant. Obviously, these are the before shots. And this is what she looks like today, after 3 years. There are some other photos showing her progress over the last 3 years, but it's all shape-shifting. In the before photo, you can see that her eyes are very far apart, and that the left is much lower than the right. In order to achieve the after photo through surgery, they'd have to fracture and reduce the size of the skull to get the eyes into normal positions. No. This is a Drac that deformed its face from its original human imitation form, and then gradually morphed back in steps to simulate surgery progress. And as you know, they can simulate injuries and generate imitations of scars. That's Ray Robinson on the left, also known as Charlie No Face, and the Green Man, since sometimes he'd be seen with green skin. He's ungenerated his eyes and nose, and left a hole in its place. He's also reformed his maxilla and jaw to more swollen shapes. The photo on the right is an attempt to recreate Ray's face, and the signature at the bottom is there to make it seem like it's a Photoshop job. It's not. That one is real too. It's another Drac morphing his face, just like Ray did. He's ungenerated his eyes and nose, and changed the shape of his maxilla and jaw. It's not a perfect copy of Ray's face, but it's reasonably close. You're looking at shape-shifting in both photos. This one hasn't completely ungenerated her eyes, but she's made them very small and angular. If she does have eyeballs in there, they're highly irregular. She's ungenerated her nose, where she has an almost perfectly round hole between her eyes. She's also removed the texture from her skin and increased the reflectivity so that it looks like plastic. One of her upper incisors is morphed into a sharp point, and her right ear is shifted to a higher position than the left. As this shows, they can generate additional teeth beyond their human imitation set and position them anywhere in the mouth. They can also be generated without roots. They don't need to be socketed into the bone like real teeth. They can generate imitations of teeth from soft tissue without bone underneath. So in that case, it's just a hardened shape molded from the surface of that tissue without any root structure below. That said, the original human imitation teeth probably do have roots and sockets. For example, in the photo on the left, the teeth in front probably have roots, but the ones behind may be superficial. In the top right photo, it's clear that some of those teeth aren't socketed, particularly the upper teeth in the middle. Those must be superficial imitations. The official explanation for this is noma, gangrene of the face, or cellulitis. No, they're all Dracs shape-shifting. They've ungenerated the tissue around their mouths, exposing the gums and teeth. The ones on the left and top right have rotated their bottom teeth so they point forward, which is impossible with a human jaw. Real teeth are socketed in the jaw, which means that the jaw edge would have to turn out 90 degrees. That's never going to happen with a human jaw. Since these are polymorphic cells molded into the shapes of teeth, they can position them any way they want. They could generate imitations of teeth anywhere on their bodies. In the top right photo, look at the boundary between the skin and gums. It looks like two pieces of plastic that have melted together. And again, that's basically what it is. A human doll made out of living alien plastic. Dracs shapeshifting. Notice that the exposed tissue still looks fresh. There's no sign of necrosis, except for the separated piece of skin in the middle photo, which is also shapeshifting. No sign of fluids either, blood or pus. That's because they use their polymorphic ability to pull the tissue back without causing any bleeding or cellular damage. You'll see a more dramatic example of this coming up, which will prove my point. Except for the Chinese imitation, the rest are all from Africa. That's because they can get away with it there. People will look at that and say, that's Africa for you. If a white imitation tried to exhibit this kind of shape-shifting in a photo, they wouldn't allow it. Here are two Indian imitations exhibiting shape-shifting under the guise of cleft palates. The one on the right has liquefied all of her upper teeth and melded them together into a continuous mass. Once again, the gums and skin there have the look of melted plastic. She's reverting those sharp creases on her neck, which we've seen a number of times before. And her head isn't even turned. She's showing them straight up. These are probably gaps between scales in the native form. Melted plastic. These two have generated similar appearances by liquefying the tissue between their eyes and mouths, where the layers under the skin are exposed. Their eyeballs have also partially liquefied at the bottom and melded together with the tissue under the lower eyelids. The one on the right appears to be reverting its fangs, which look very similar to the ones below, as they've come forward and turned more to the front. The one on the left has turned its bottom row of teeth inward, so that the front sides are facing up. There may be a fang coming out as well, on the left side. Like the liquid bones woman, I have a lot of respect for this individual because she's showing something very significant here. The official explanation is that it's a flesh-eating disease, but that's obviously not the case. For one, a human wouldn't have survived to this point, where half the skull was exposed with a rotted out eye socket. Secondly, the tissue would be necrotic. It would be dark and covered with dried blood and pus. Some of the tissue would probably be liquefying as well, so it would be a nasty looking mess. Her tissue doesn't look anything like that. It's clean, shiny, and brightly colored. No sign of blood or pus. It looks like plastic. There's also sharp definition and separation between the soft tissue and bone, and that's not what human anatomy looks like. The skull doesn't look like real bone either. It looks like a crude plastic imitation of a human skull, and that's what it is. You're looking at a plasticized imitation of a human body made out of alien cells. What she's done is opened a hole in the skin in subcutaneous layers and expanded it over half of her head. Those cells are still around, but they've been pushed out to the edges and compressed. I know that they can do this because I've seen it in person, though not nearly to this extent. I've seen someone open a pencil-wide hole in their temple and then close it later. Ordinarily, I think that their soft tissues and bones would look more realistic, but she's intentionally reduced the complexity so that it becomes obvious that it's not a human body. That's why she's made the tissue look like plastic. She's trying to show that it's an imitation of a human body, not the real thing. This one has pulled back the skin, but not the soft tissue underneath, so there isn't any bone exposed. Again, it has somewhat of a plastic look, though not as obvious as the one on the right. To show that it's shape-shifting, she's moved one of her upper teeth above the row. These two could instantly restore the flesh over their faces and look normal again. So as you can see, they can simulate horrific injuries without pain or blood loss, and they can regenerate back to normal at any time. I'm sure if they stayed in this exposed state for a fair amount of time, the tissue would become infected and eventually die. But at a minimum, it's clear that their supernatural cells are far more resistant to that than normal cells. Notice that someone made a digital smear going right from her neck. They probably did this to make people question whether the picture is real or not. It is real. This is a video of her, which was intentionally made at low quality. They also added some panning and zooming effects, presumably to make the video look less realistic. When they show serious shape-shifting like this, they have to reduce the quality, and sometimes alter the picture so that it leaves some doubt as to whether it's real or not. As you can see, the guy is putting the forceps inside of her eye socket, so that shows that it's real. In these photos, you can see that she's reverting her clavicles as they become curved and more pronounced, and they fuse together above the sternum. In the photo on the left, she's also reverting the scale segments in her right brow. In this frame, she's reverting the primary tendon or muscle in the side of her neck. That's further proof that she's a drac. I believe that if I were to meet this individual in person, she would completely revert to her native form if I asked her. As all the dracs do, she would know that I'm Yeshua HaMashiach. That's why I've seen so much shapeshifting in my personal life. These two are also Dracs that have opened and pulled back the skin and subcutaneous layers to expose their skulls. The one on the left supposedly had the top of his scalp eaten away by maggots. But if you look closely at the so-called maggots, it's clear that they're not really maggots. They're just shapes he's generated to look like maggots. That's why they took the picture out of focus. That is his skull, though. The one on the right has reduced the complexity of his skin to make it look like rubber. He's also reduced the complexity of his features, his nose and ear appearing somewhat melted, and his eyes enlarged and moved farther apart. There's no hair on his face or the side of his head either. He's ungenerated all of it. These are all Dracs simulating injuries. The one in the middle is the most extreme I've seen, supposedly the result of a gunshot wound. But if it were a gunshot wound, it would have to be a large caliber rifle round or buckshot fired at close range from a shotgun. It would also have to enter from the back of the head to create that type of exit wound. If that were the case, he'd definitely be dead, if he were human anyway. Not only is he not dead, he's still conscious, and there's very little blood out. No, this is a Drac that used his polymorphic ability to open his face, skin, muscle, and bone, leaving the insides exposed. It looks like he doesn't even have a skull in there anymore. It's just a hole filled with soft tissue. You can also see that he's reverting the folds on his abdomen, and again, that's to tell you that he's a Drac, and that the wound is actually shape-shifting. They can simulate damage like this as long as it doesn't interfere with the function of the vital organs. They can compress their organs and move them around, so they can simulate extreme damage that would be guaranteed fatal for a human. And when they're actually wounded by an attack, they can almost instantly regenerate the damaged parts, provided they don't lose consciousness. For example, they could compress their brains down around the stem, so shooting them in their heads above that wouldn't stop them. However, as I said, there are bound to be drawbacks to having overly compressed organs. Still, in a situation like that, it's better than having your brains blown out. They can generate openings anywhere in their bodies by pulling back the layers of tissue. Much like the guy with the blown open face, it looks like the skeletal structure inside the foot has been broken down. The other one has pulled back the tissue to expose his spine. And again, it looks too neat and clean to be real injury on a human body. No necrotic tissue, no blood or any other fluids. Notice that he's reverting the creases on the back of his neck to show that he's a Drac. Exposed bones in the forearm and lower leg. The one on the right may look more like a drawing, but it is a photo of an actual leg. The skin, subcutaneous layers, and muscles have been liquefied, separated, and pulled back, those cells compressed along the edges of the opening. The question I have is, can he move his foot around with his leg in that state? I mean tilt the foot up and down and move the toes around. Because if that were a human leg, he wouldn't be able to do that. The muscles that perform those actions are mostly gone, and the nerve pathways are gone as well. They know the answer, but I can only guess at this point. They may be able to motivate their skeletons without the use of muscles, by moving the bone cells around with their polymorphic ability. And they may not even need nerve connections to do that. If that's true, then they could basically turn themselves into living skeletons. Again, the limitation being the extent to which they could compress their internal organs. This one has pulled back the skin in subcutaneous layers to expose the muscle and some of the bone around the wrist. Look at the skin edge on the right side. Again, it looks too neat and clean, almost like a piece of rubber that's been cut away. This was supposedly caused by a flesh-eating drug or disease, but if that were the case, the tissue wouldn't look so fresh anymore. The reason it still looks fresh is because he just did this right before the picture was taken, and he morphed the tissue back into place right after the picture was taken. As I said, their cells may be more resistant to infection and rotting than natural cells, but I have no doubt that if he left it in this state for several days, it would get infected. This looks just like the tissue in the forearm, very fresh and clean, without a trace of blood. This one was supposedly caused by a flesh-eating drug, but there's absolutely no sign of decay. It looks like the skin was cut away right before this picture was taken, and it was, using his polymorphic ability. If this were a human leg and the skin was cut off like this, there would obviously be a tremendous amount of bleeding. But you don't see a single drop here. Right after this picture was taken, he morphed the tissue back into place, restoring the leg to normal. This one has pulled back the skin in several spots, but the tissue underneath doesn't look like muscle. He or she has changed the texture and color of that tissue so that it has the appearance of charcoal. Notice that the right lower leg is elongated, and again, that's to show that the rest of it is shape-shifting.
This one is supposedly a murder victim whose face was eaten by an animal. But again, civil examination and reasoning prove that's not the case. First off, there isn't a single drop of blood or piece of tissue anywhere on the ground or in his body. He also has eyebrows and hair on his scalp. That means he still has skin over his skull, so his face obviously hasn't been eaten. This is a drac who compressed all of the soft tissue on his head down to the bone, and then ungenerated his eyeballs and changed the color of his skin. In the photo on the right, you can see that he's done the same thing with his right arm. It's been compressed down to the bone. You can also see the ground through his mouth, which means that he's ungenerated spine there. So his head may be detached from the rest of his body, which he could survive and regenerate, as long as the head isn't separated too far away. This one has generated the appearance of desiccated, almost mummified tissue on his head, but on the rest of his body, this tissue looks fresh. He also has that opening in the skin on the left side of his torso, and it has the same kind of clean-cut edge we've seen before, again without a single drop of blood anywhere. I'm absolutely certain that these two individuals are alive, and right after these pictures were taken, they were generated back to their normal human imitation forms. So this shows that dracs can generate the appearance of being dead using their polymorphic ability. They could walk around looking like zombies or even skeletons, and they could do that in any form, including native form, a dragon zombie.
These are individuals with what appear to be parasitic twins. I suppose it's naturally possible for something like this to occur. It's hard to say until you see a confirmed human like this. But I'm certain that these three are Dracs. They're generating extra body parts which they could ungenerate at any time. That's her right after she had supposed surgery to remove the supposed parasitic twin. Do you really think that's possible? In the before shot, the pelvi are rotated 90 degrees out to the sides, so the matched leg pairs are on the sides. They'd have to cut off the twin while keeping the musculature intact, and then rotate the pelvis back to the upright position. And even then, the torso would be much longer than it is on the right. That's if she's human. If she's a Drac, she just ungenerates those extra parts and returns to her normal human imitation form. That's the real explanation for what we're seeing here. These aren't parasitic twins. They're just extra limbs and digits. Again, I suppose this is naturally possible since I've seen it on animals and photos, though never in person. But regardless, we know that the Dracs can generate extra digits, since they have to add 2 fingers and 3 toes to imitate human hands and feet. I wouldn't be surprised if they could generate additional limbs as well. The bottom middle frame is definitely a Drac, with those melded fingers. These two are obviously Dracs, shape-shifting and making the V sign with their tongues out. Were they naturally born this way, or did they meld their bodies together using their polymorphic ability? I have no way of knowing that, but I believe it's possible for 2 or more Dracs to meld together into one body. To merge 2 individuals like this, they'd compress opposing sides of their bodies, ungenerate the arm and leg on that side, switch the cells to the fluid state, bind the bones at key points, and then meld the tissue together. They may separate when they revert to their native forms, or they may stay together, turning into a very wide Drac with 2 heads. This merging ability would also be useful for infiltration purposes. Several individuals could compress down to very small sizes and then be absorbed into the body of a single individual. Once they get inside, the others separate from the host and decompress to their normal sizes. They see one go in, but they get 3, 4 more on the inside. You can see that she's a Drac from those neck creases in the left frame. She's either ungenerated her arms, or they were severed and destroyed. The other possibility is that it's a birth defect, but I doubt that. I don't have any direct evidence, but anecdotal evidence suggests that the Dracs can reattach severed limbs and make them whole again, provided that the cells are still alive. In some vampire mythologies, they're known to reattach limbs, and that's also true of the T-1000 in Terminator 2, which is based on them. They might be able to regenerate a small appendage like a finger if it's permanently severed and destroyed, but I doubt that they could regenerate a destroyed arm or leg. That's my guess, but I may be wrong about that. Notice that she's able to drive cars and use keypad devices with just her feet. Since their body mechanics are controlled by their polymorphic ability, they can use their feet almost as if they were hands, and they can bend and rotate their joints in a very wide range, as you've seen.
This one is also demonstrating that ability, as she's able to use a bow with her feet.
Kenny Easterday was a drac, showing the V sign and bent back thumb in the left and middle photos. It's supposedly a birth defect, but he may have chosen to ungenerate that part of his body at an early age. But that's not what matters here. The important question is, how is he balancing on only one arm? He's not even on his palms in the left and middle photos. He's standing on his fingers. That is simply not possible with a human body. You would fall and probably injure your shoulder joint, and you certainly wouldn't attempt balancing on the edge of a pool table. But he shows no signs of effort in supporting his weight with one arm. There are two possibilities. One, he's reduced his weight and shifted his center of gravity lower, either by using his polymorphic ability or technology. Or his arms and joints are so strong and rigid that he can hold himself in place no matter where his center of gravity is. The example I'm going to show next definitely supports the first case, so that's what I think is happening. He's reduced his body weight to the point where it takes almost no effort to hold himself up. In fact, I think he may actually be levitating. It's possible that he could do this using his polymorphic ability. I've seen their teeth liquefy and drip upward against gravity. If they did this with every cell in their bodies, it might cause them to levitate, or at least become very light. Presumably it would use up energy to do this, since the cells are working against gravity. The other possibility is that he has technology on or inside his body which is levitating. I know that this technology exists. Not only have I seen it in videos, I've seen it in person on several occasions. They have these flying orbs, which can be considered anti-gravity craft. I've seen two of them up close, from just a few feet away. One was a silver and black sphere about the size of a softball, and the other was a gray ellipsoid, not much bigger than an egg. They hovered and flew quietly, except that the softball orb started making an accelerated spinning noise as it flew up into the sky. He may have a device like that on or inside his body which is effectively reducing his weight. They can switch their cells to the fluid state and insert objects into their bodies. When they switch back to the solid state, the object is locked in, as if it were part of the body. Here's another one that's missing the lower half of his body. In the middle photo, he's balancing on a bowling ball. But no matter how strong or rigid your body is, the ball is going to roll if your center of gravity isn't directly over it. His center of gravity is well behind the ball, so if he had weight, it would roll. The only explanation for this is that he's levitating, either by using his polymorphic ability or technology. In the photo on the left, he's morphed the fingers of his right hand into flat and angular shapes, and there's actually very little motion, just that bright light. He's showing the horn sign on the right, and you know what that means. So there's no doubt that he's a drac. The point of these two is to show that they have an ability to levitate, or at least become weightless, as well as the fact that they can live without the lower halves of their bodies, lacking a pelvis. The official explanation is Treacher-Collins syndrome, which again in most cases is actually shape-shifting. In the top middle photo, her left eye is triangular, and in the bottom photo, she's removed all of the texture from her skin, so it looks like a plastic model. In the top left photo, you can see that the mother is reverting neck creases, and in the photo on the right, you can see that the sister's neck is elongated. So once again, the secondary shape-shifting tells you that she's a drac as well. This is another one who chose or was chosen to make a lifelong commitment, at least in this quote-unquote human lifespan. This is a drac that's generated the appearance of old age while in the form of an infant. They simulate human aging with their polymorphic ability by changing the skin texture and tautness, the hair color and fullness, and the shapes and sizes of the features, so they can make themselves look younger or older at any time. They could be infants with elderly faces, or elderly individuals with young faces, or they could be elderly individuals with the bodies of 20-year-olds, which I've seen a few times. It may look like a human infant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an equivalent age in its natural state. This could be an adult drac. We know that they can compress to much smaller sizes, so I wouldn't be surprised if an adult drac could compress to the size of a human infant. If this is actually an infant in its natural state, it shows that they have full control over their polymorphic ability from the time they're born. This child imitation has generated a mask-like protrusion from its face, which extends from the upper lip to the top of the head. It created this appearance by extruding the tissue straight out along a sharp edge, removing all of the texture from the skin, and increasing the hardness and reflectivity. So it looks like it's wearing a plastic mask, but it's really part of the face, made out of living tissue. Even for someone who doesn't know anything about dracs, they would have to question how this is naturally possible, because it's not possible. Nature would never create this. However, for a drac shapeshifter, it's easy to do. They could all generate this appearance spontaneously. This one has drastically altered its human imitation form, but you really can't say it's deformed, because its face is symmetrical and consistent. It's just not a human face. Of course, the green skin is a giveaway that it's a drac. It's also partially reverted its eyes, as you can see that it has slit pupils and green sclerae. The neck is clearly elongated, and creases are visible in the photo on the right. It's moved the ears onto its neck, and that's further proof that it's not human. Human ears are cartilage, and it's always attached to the bone, so you can't have ears on your neck if you're human. This drac's ears are just shapes molded out of skin cells. That's why it can have ears on its neck, or anywhere else on its body, anywhere there's skin. Again, this could be an infant in its natural state, but it's more likely that it's an adult drac, given the degree of the shapeshifting. The dracs can spontaneously create simple forms like this one, but complex and detailed forms like a human face and body have to be designed first, basically using computer modeling programs. The form data from the program is encoded into a biological format and then imprinted into their cells, perhaps the DNA. This imprinting process is probably electromagnetic, but that's just a guess on my part. Their cells now contain the new form code, which will allow them to physically morph into their human imitation forms. So you're seeing a 3D computer model of a human body, realized in physical form. Everyone you see in the media, that's what they are. You're looking at 3D computer models made up of living cells. It's not too different from character creation in a video game. You choose a base model and then adjust the individual features to create a more unique appearance. But no matter how much you change the features, you find that characters based on the same model all tend to look similar. The eyes, nose, and mouth may be different, but the overall shapes and proportions of their faces are the same. That's why there are so many lookalikes in the population. That's true even among celebrities and politicians, who are chosen for their more unique appearances. Now I'm going to show you examples of these lookalikes from the celebrity population. Hilary Swank on the left and Missy Peregrine on the right. When I read names, it'll always be left to right. They have the same overall facial structure and proportions. The only differences are their eyes and the ends of their noses, and Hilary has a taller forehead due to the hairline being higher. Their eyes may actually be the same. It's just that Hilary has folds over her upper eyelids, which changes the outer shape. They also have the same eyebrows and hair shape and type. Remember that their hair is skin cells formed into fibers, so the shape, length, style, and color is determined by the imitation code as well. Michael J. Fox and Scott Wolf. Fox and Wolf. Get it? Same overall facial structure and proportions, same mouth and basically the same eyes, and they have the same hair shape as well. The only significant difference is the end of the nose. The bridges are actually fairly similar. Jennifer Carpenter and Hope Solo. Same overall facial structure and proportions, same nose and mouth, and similar eyes. And they both have epicanthic folds over the inner corners, which are common to Asian races like Chinese and Japanese, but very rare among whites. They also have the same eyebrows and hair shape. Other than eye, hair, and skin color, the only notable difference is that Jennifer's nose is shorter, which makes her upper lip area taller. Lucy Hale and Selena Gomez. Same overall facial structure and proportions. Their eyes and the ends of their noses are different, but the rest is pretty much the same, including the hair shape. They have the same base imitation code, but they changed some of the features to make one look white and the other Hispanic. Jeffrey Dean Morgan and Javier Bardem. Same overall facial structure and proportions, similar eyes and mouths. They even have the same eyebrows and facial hair. The ends of their noses are the most notable difference. Anna Greichwitz and Maggie Gyllenhaal. Same overall facial structure and proportions, same mouth, similar noses, and slightly different eyes. And again, same hair shape and type. Ian Somerhalder and Rob Lowe. Same base imitation code with similar features, mouth, nose, and the eyes are almost identical. Heather Graham and Jayma Mays. Everything is practically the same except for their noses. They also have the same eyebrows and hair shape. Amanda Seyfried and Dakota Fanning. Same base imitation code and similar features, but there are differences which keep them from looking identical. Amanda's lips are bigger, her nostrils are more upturned, and her eyes are farther apart. If you just changed those things, they'd look exactly alike. And once again, they have the same eyebrows and hair shape. Evan Rachel Wood and Alexandra Breckenridge. Their noses and eyes are somewhat different, but everything else is the same, including the eyebrows and hair shape. Kareena Kapoor and Paris Hilton. Here's another cross-racial imitation code. Except for their eyes, the rest of their features are very similar. Kareena's nostrils slant up more, but that's really the only other difference. With their eyes covered, it looks like it could be the same person with a tan and changed in hair color and style. Dustin Hoffman and Francois Cluzet. The ends of their noses are completely different, but other than that, they're very close. Judy Greer and Anne Heche. Same base imitation code, but their eyes and noses are different. Khloe Kardashian and Joni Lore, China. Another Indian and white cross-racial code. Of course, they're really the same race, both Dracs, but that's the appearance that humans see. It's alien cells generating shape, texture, and color. It has absolutely nothing to do with human genetics. Helena Christensen and Cameron Diaz. Except for their noses, they're quite close. It's definitely the same base imitation code. You can also see that Helena is reverting the creases in her neck. Nina Dobrev and Jenny Farley. Slightly different eyes, noses, and mouths, but they have the exact same facial proportions. They also have the same hair type and hairline. BJ Novak and Juan Martín del Potro. Their hairlines are different, and BJ's eyes slant down to the outside, but if those were changed, their faces would be almost identical. Renee Zellweger and Joey Lauren Adams. Renee keeps altering her facial code, so she doesn't look like this anymore. But at the time this photo was taken, her code was very close to Joey's. If the hoods over Renee's upper eyelids were removed, their eyes would probably look the same. Brad Pitt and Benicio del Toro. Again, if the hoods were removed from Benicio's upper eyelids, their eyes would probably look the same. Other than that, the ends of their noses are somewhat different, and Brad has a bigger lower lip. Those are the only notable differences. Caroline Forrest and Matt Bellamy. Sometimes they use the same base imitation code for male and female imitations. To adapt it to a female imitation, they typically make the eyes larger and the nose and jaw smaller. That's exactly what they've done to create Caroline's face from Matt's face. Other than that, the only difference is that Matt has that projected bulbous septum. Kathy Griffin and Martin Short. Kathy's jaw is smaller, and her eyes are a bit larger than Martin's, but apart from that, they didn't change much. and their noses are almost identical. That's why Kathy looks like a man in drag, because she's using a male imitation code with weak adaptation. R.J. Mitt and Kendall Jenner. This appears to be the opposite case, a female imitation code adapted to a male imitation. His nose and jaw are larger, and his lips are smaller, but the facial proportions are very close, and they have the exact same eyes, which are obviously meant to be female eyes. Todd Rundgren and Liv Tyler. This is more of an androgynous code, which works decently for either sex. Liv has bigger eyes and a smaller nose, but their faces are basically the same below the nose. Billy Corgan and Kirsten Dunst. Kirsten's nose and jaw are slightly smaller, but everything else matches. The shapes of the features are exactly the same: eyes, nose, and mouth. They have the same crooked teeth as well, which you don't see here. This code appears to be originally intended for male imitation, but it adapts decently to a female imitation. Now we're looking at historical lookalikes. That's imitation codes that were used in the past that are being used in the present. This is Tommy Lee Jones and Andrew Johnson. They have the same overall facial structure and proportions, and the features are quite similar, with the biggest difference being the nose. Tommy slopes inward at the midpoint, whereas Andrew's is straight all the way down. They have the same folds over their upper eyelids and the same kind of elongated ears. Their hair shapes and hairlines also match. Abraham Lincoln and Bill Nye. Same overall facial structure and proportions. The end of Bill's nose is more pointed and down-slanted than Abe's, and his eyes are smaller. But otherwise, it's a close match. And they have some specific features in common: the creases on the cheeks behind the mouth, the protruding cheekbones, and the sunken temples with rough skin texture. They also have the same type of neck. If you could see the rest of their bodies, they would probably look very similar as well. Ellen DeGeneres and Henry David Thoreau. This is another androgynous imitation code, probably better suited to female imitations. It's a close match. The biggest difference is the end of the nose, which is more bulbous on Henry. Notice that they have the same groove running down from the corner of their mouths. That confirms that it's the same imitation code. And once again, they also have the same hair shape, spiked and swept. Jason Segel and Lee J. Cobb. Lee has bigger eyes, but apart from that, it's hard to find things that are different about them. They even have the same bulged out bone on the sides of their foreheads. That's a rather unusual feature, and along with everything else that matches, it's absolute proof that it's the same imitation code. Eddie Murphy and an unknown man from the 1890s. These two are also very close, clearly the same imitation code. The man on the right has more upturned nostrils, and his ears are smaller. Those are the only differences that I can see. They even have the same eyebrows and mustache.
It didn't make a lot of sense to me either the first time I saw your face on another guy. Genetic dice? No, I don't think so. I think somebody just screwed up. As good as you are, you do make mistakes, don't you? You should have broke the mold, Gordy.
This is Joseph Merrick, the so-called Elephant Man. As you know now, elephantiasis is a fake disease. This does not happen to a human body under any circumstances. Joseph Merrick was a drac shapeshifted into this form. His supposed skeleton is a fraud, and that should be obvious when you look at these photos. His right arm is clearly much longer than his left, mostly in the forearm, which is why he always poses it bent. If he had it hanging straight down, the tips of his fingers would go below the knee. Now look at the skeleton's arms. They're the same length. They posed it to make the arms look uneven, but they are the same length. In the photo on the left, notice that the left side of his ribcage is bulged out, and presumably that's bone. You don't see that on the skeleton. The skeleton really doesn't look that deformed. It looks like they slapped some plaster on the skull and right femur, and then bent the spine into a hunched-over pose. Now look at his right hand in the photo on the left. It's almost twice as wide as his left hand, including the fingers. The fingers are spaced much farther apart, so there's no question that the bone structure is wider. That's not just swelling in the soft tissue. Look at the skeleton's right hand. It's not much bigger than the left, if at all. The fingers are about the same size, and they're not spaced any farther apart. Now we're going to take a close look at the skull. This doesn't look like a real skull to me. It lacks texture and detail. The extraneous formations look like plaster resin that was once liquid, too smooth and flowing. And the bottom edge of the maxilla is smooth and featureless. What happened to the sockets for the other teeth? The Dracs could make their imitation skulls look like this, but this isn't one of them. The Drac known as Joseph Merrick shifted back to his normal human imitation form, went back to his real name, or took a new one, and they assembled this fake skeleton to put on display. The purpose of all of this was to set a precedent for all the shape-shifting people would be seeing in the future. They could call it elephantiasis, and people would accept that explanation. Otherwise, they might actually have to think for themselves and come up with their own explanation. This is a real skull, and it's obvious that the Merrick skull doesn't possess anywhere near this level of detail. Granted, a Drax imitation skull wouldn't have the complexity of a real skull, but it wouldn't be quite this lacking. This can't be the skull of a formerly living creature. The real explanation is that it's all shape-shifting. All of these so-called diseases that cause tissue to liquefy, skin to turn into bark, flesh to open to the bone, body parts to double in size, and horns to grow out of heads. Everything you see here, they can all do this at any time. For example, let's say you're talking to one of them face to face, and he suddenly pulls back all of the soft tissue from his skull. So now you're looking at a living skull, and he still may be able to speak. Then he switches the bone cells to the fluid state and splits his skull open down the middle, exposing the insides. He reverts his skull to its native form as you watch it close and morph into a dragon skull. He restores the soft tissue over his skull and liquefies the cells in the rest of his body. His body goes soft and collapses into a heap on the floor, with the arms, legs, and torso all melded together into one mass. So now you're looking at a melted pile of living tissue with a dragon's head on top. The pile crawls away a short distance, leaving the clothes behind. He morphs his limbs back into place, straightens out, and switches the cells back to the solid state. As he stands up, he begins reverting the rest of his body to its native form. The arms, legs, torso, and neck elongate. His body changes shape, the back rounding into a hump, the chest bulging out, the thighs becoming angular, the hands and feet turning into claws, and the tail growing out. So you watch him rise to your height, and he continues to grow until you're looking up at a 10-foot tall dragon. That's what he really is, and he's always a dragon, even in his human imitation form. He's just changed the shape of his body, along with the other physical characteristics, the color, hardness, elasticity, and so on. And there's nothing human about it at all. They are shape-shifting, liquid plastic aliens. That's the simplest way I can describe it. They can assume almost any form, and everything I just described they can do. There are only two limitations to this ability. One is that they can't compress or deform their vital organs beyond a certain point. For example, it's very unlikely that the heart would be sufficiently functional if it were too small, or reduced to a semi-fluid state. The other limitation is that they can't reproduce the biology or physiology of the creatures that they're imitating. They can simulate some of the physiological processes, like sweating, but it doesn't happen in the same way it does in humans. Humans produce sweat from glands, but they simulate sweating by releasing water directly from the skin cells. It's not a biological necessity for them. They're just doing it for show, to appear human, and it's a completely voluntary act. There's one more potential limitation, in that they may not be able to accurately mimic the movements of the creatures that they're imitating. Bipeds are not a problem, since they're naturally bipedal. But imitating quadrupeds, winged creatures, or forms with more than 4 limbs may result in less convincing movements.
This human life form could be a mask. If we could see it without the camouflage.
You're right. Then at least we'd know what we were dealing with.
These things can imitate us, they can infiltrate us, and breed a legion before anyone would even notice.
How could you do this? How could you do this? You take something, you make it like a man. A man who's not a man.
Manny!
He's a thing.
Manny!
This monstrous alien has turned itself into something that looks like a human. It has the external details of a human body, but it lacks the physiology. It's an imperfect imitation. All of your leaders are these things, your presidents and prime ministers, senators, parliament members, and so on. This has been true of almost all of the emperors and kings throughout history. And your religious leaders, priests, reverends, rabbis, imams, everyone you see in the media, in news and entertainment, on TV, in movies, sports, pornography. They're all dragons hiding inside plastic imitations of human bodies. This is what you've been worshipping, loving, and lusting after. You have been fornicating with these abominations, who are the children of Satan. You cannot trust anyone until you have physically verified that they are human. You can't tell if someone's a drac just by their race, body type, or social status. As you've seen, they can imitate any human race, and they can generate any body type and size. That said, I can identify fat female imitations when their bodies don't have realistic proportions. But other than that, you really can't tell. Nearly all of the rich and influential individuals in society are dracs. That's true. But they're not all at the top. You can find them at every level of society. So you can't assume that someone can't be a drac because they're poor. And I know this from personal experience. It could be someone that looks like a meth addict, missing teeth, emaciated, and that individual could be a drac. They're just generating that appearance. They could generate any appearance. Some of the individuals in this photo are almost certainly dracs, and if they were forced to revert here, all of a sudden you'd see 10-foot-tall dragons towering over the human crowd. What would happen to their clothes is they'd either rip apart, if possible, or they'd be absorbed into their bodies, though that could be dangerous, as it might interfere with the function of their internal organs. The humans in this photo wouldn't be so calm anymore when they see the person next to them turn into a monster.
So how do we know who's human? If I was an imitation, a perfect imitation, how would you know if it was really me?
Unlike the alien in John Carpenter's The Thing, the Drac's human imitation forms are not perfect imitations. They can't reproduce the physiology of a human body. They can't even generate structures to imitate cartilage. All humans have cartilage in their noses and ears, but Drac imitations don't. That's what you're looking at here. You can press the ends of their noses flat, which you can't do with an intact human nose. However, as I found out recently, they can increase the firmness of that tissue to make it harder to push in. It still doesn't have any structure in it, but it may take some force to make it collapse. The ends of their noses can be completely bent to the side or even folded in half, with the nostrils facing up. I haven't found an example of a folded up nose yet, but I know they can do it. And this shows that they don't have cartilage in their ears. Speaking to the humans, try doing that with your own ears. You can't pull them out that far, and they won't deform and flatten out like that. That's because your ears are cartilage, except for the lobes. It's not just a loose piece of skin hanging off the side of your head. It's a semi-rigid structure that's attached to the bone. Without it, you wouldn't have ears on the outside, or a tip on your nose. That's what gives our noses and ears their shape. These two are also doing some shape-shifting. The one on the right has expanded his lips and turned them inside out, and the one on the left has elongated her maxilla, the area between her nose and mouth. This shows that their ears can be folded over from the back with very little effort. You can fold a human ear to some extent, but it requires a fair amount of force, and it won't fold flat like this. Another way to identify a drac is to check if they have real pores with sebaceous glands. A drac's imitation pores are just empty craters or pockets in the surface of the skin. It's nothing more than texture. You can see that here. They don't contain sebaceous glands, so when you squeeze them, nothing will come out, except perhaps water. but definitely no sebum. The easiest way to test this is by pushing up on the bottom of a nostril. If strings of white paste come out of the pores, which is sebum, that individual is a human. If not, that individual is a drac. I've never tested this on a drac, but I know it's true, because I can just look at them and see that they don't have real pores. As I've shown, a drac's imitation hair is skin cells formed into fibers, so it doesn't have roots or follicles like real hair. When you try to pluck them, you'll find that they're tougher to pull out than human hairs, and they'll never come out with a root or follicle on the end. I've tried this on 2 different dracs, and I noticed that they started focusing on the one hair I was trying to pull out, after I couldn't get it out at first. They were using their polymorphic ability to detach that one hair, and it did come out after that, but it didn't have a root on the end. We're going to take a close look at Benjamin Netanyahu's face, and you'll see that he doesn't have real pores or hair follicles. It's clear that those are just empty pockets and craters in the skin. They don't contain sebaceous glands, so nothing will come out if they're squeezed. He doesn't have hair follicles either. If he were human, you'd see stubble below the sideburn, but there's nothing at all. Just those strange pockets in the skin, which you wouldn't see with human skin. There isn't a single hair on his face. On a human, even with the closest shape possible, you're still going to see stubble, and a few hours later it will already be growing out noticeably. The only way for a human to achieve this is by waxing, or going through a procedure to kill the follicles. But that's not the case here. The reason Netanyahu doesn't have hair follicles is because he's not human. He's a dragon imitating a human body. His hair doesn't grow from follicles. It's formed from skin cells, which he can generate and ungenerate at any time. He could imitate stubble, but it still won't have follicles. This shows that they can generate body types to imitate animals, including quadrupeds. The only question is, would they be able to adequately mimic quadrupedal movement? Even if they could imitate the form of a horse, could they run like one? Or if they imitate a flying creature, could they sustain flight just through the use of their wings? I've seen them move in werewolf imitation forms and ape-like forms, but those were semi-bipedal knuckle walkers. I've also seen them in tree imitation forms, but they were fully bipedal. I may have seen them in quadruped and winged forms, as dogs, cats, and bats, but they're more difficult to identify as common animals. Obviously, when I see werewolves and walking trees, I know that those are dracs. Dog, cat, and bird imitations would be very useful to them, so they may have codes for those as well, even if they can't perfectly mimic the movement. It would be very easy for the dracs to design imitations of Zeta Reticulant forms, the Grey-type aliens that have become the stereotype alien in mainstream media. And they could create these based on their human imitation forms, make the body smaller and thinner, less muscular, increase the size of the head in relation, especially the cranium, make the eyes bigger and the nose and mouth smaller, ungenerate the hair, and change the skin color to gray or green, and now you have something that looks like a theoretical Zeta Reticulan. Whether the Zetas are a real species or not, I have no idea. They may exist in other parts of the galaxy, but I'm certain that all of the sightings on Earth are Dracs imitating that form. In the photo on the left, which I believe is real, you can see that its right eye has a slit pupil and green sclera. That's definitely a Drac, and it's doing that to show you that it's a Drac. And the individual who took that picture is a Drac. They set that up for that purpose, to show you that they can generate Zeta-type forms. I believe that the one in the middle is also real, in that it's a real creature, but it's not that species. It's another Drac that's generating that form, and we know that they can simulate injuries like this. The one at the top right is too crude to be a natural creature. It's either a Drac generating that form, or it's someone wearing a suit. If the Zetas are a real species, then we know they've already been taken over by the Dracs, because they can imitate their forms. So whenever we encounter a non-human sentient species, we'd have to determine if that's what they really are, or if they're Dracs generating imitations. If they have hair but no follicles, or external ears or noses but no cartilage, then we'd know they're Dracs. But if they don't have those features, it would be difficult to identify them from their basic physiology. Once we've analyzed the Drac cells and DNA, that would give us a reliable method of identification, no matter what form they take. Any sentient race we encounter would have to be tested before we'd be open to interacting with them.
It could have imitated 1,000,000 life forms on 1,000,000 planets, could change into any one of them at any time. Now it wants life forms on Earth.
I have seen them in werewolf imitation forms, and I can say that this picture is quite accurate. The individual that drew this is almost certainly a Drac, and you can see that it'd be fairly simple for them to design this form from the native form. Make the legs shorter, the tail smaller, change the hands and feet, remove the horns and spikes, make the skin smooth, and of course generate fur all over the body. A dragon has been turned into something that looks like a werewolf. It's much less of a change than going to a human imitation form. All Dracs appear to have werewolf forms, and they are the source of those legends. A werewolf form is very useful in that it has the size and strength of the native form, but is not recognizable as the native form. So they can kill and feed in this form without humans identifying them as dragons. That explains the legend of werewolves, not really wolves, but shape-shifting dragons generating those forms.
Do not let my form frighten you, Alyssa. I can assume any form I wish.
I saw these werewolf and plant imitation forms on the last day of my fast, November 2nd, 2016. That's where I was sleeping, on that bench. That morning, I tried to crawl up the trail, but I quickly became exhausted, and I couldn't move any further from this point. While I was lying here, I saw one of the werewolf imitations walk behind the bench, about 40 feet away. The rest were on the other side of the river there, either standing or pacing around. From what I could see, there were close to 20 of them, most of them on the right bank, and a few on the left. Some of them were very large, but the rest were noticeably smaller in comparison. Later, I saw a Drac in tree imitation form walk by the bench in the same spot. He was very tall and thin,
with relatively short arms and legs, but it didn't have many branches, just at the top, where there was a cluster of foliage. So it looked like a tapered cylinder with arms and legs, and some foliage on top. It didn't look like a real tree at all, though if it were standing back in the woods, you probably wouldn't notice it. I showed these photos earlier of them generating bark skin and branch-like structures, so you can see that it's entirely possible for them to assume treant-type forms. I saw another drac in treant form in this direction. I watched it cross the river and come to the side of this bank, standing only about 10 feet away from me. This one was much wider than the other one, and it had more of a humanoid shape. It had a few small branches on the head and shoulders, and the leaves were vine-like, hanging down in long sections. I could see that it had a mouth, but I couldn't see the eyes, and it was making groaning noises, like a tree creaking in the wind. It was standing on the side of the bank, so I could only see the upper half of its body. It doesn't show that well in the photo, but the bank drops off steeply where those rocks are, down about 8 feet to the water. So based on that, I'd estimate that it was at least 10 feet tall, maybe up to 12 feet. The night before, between 11 p.m. and midnight, I began to hear large groups of people chanting and singing in the distance, which sounded like celebrations to me. A few times I heard my name called out. Earlier that night, I had tried to crawl up the trail, but I was too weak and I collapsed, though I never lost consciousness. I started hearing the singing and chanting soon after that, and there were people on the trail behind me, watching me from a distance. I also heard metal drums or gongs being struck, which had a strange reverberation to them that sounded like multiple echoes over several seconds. After about an hour or so, the human voices stopped, and then I began to hear several monstrous voices coming from different directions. They were shouting out threats against me, saying things like, "Just fucking kill him," and "Christian, we will tear you apart." They all spoke English, except for one that I couldn't understand or identify as any other human language. I believe that one was speaking Draconic. There was roaring as well, which sounded similar to the newborn's roar, but not quite as strong as that. Some of them roared for a long time though, close to 10 seconds, so they obviously have a huge lung capacity. So what you're hearing from the newborn is what their voices sound like naturally. And now I have some other examples that you can hear for yourself. I found an example of a partially reverted voice in the Manowar song Bridge of Death. When I first heard this, it reminded me of the voices that I heard in the park in the last 2 days of my fast. I found 2 other Manowar songs that contain voice reversions, and they're consistent with the newborn's voice. You'll hear those in a bit.
Demanding the sacred right to burn in hell. Ride up on hell's hot wing. Face one more evil than thou. Take my lustful soul.
These are audio clips of the newborn's roar, the second of which will be used for comparison. Here's a comparison between the newborn's roar and the one in the song. The roar in the song isn't as strong because the voice isn't as deeply reverted, but it has the same pattern to it, that guttural, gravelly fluctuation. This is from the Man-O-War song, The Demon's Whip. This one is just a roar, but the voice is more deeply reverted than it is in Bridge of Death.
Hell's wind and incantations. Summon living fire.
This is a very close match to the newborn's roar. Obviously, this involves more than just the larynx being reverted. The lungs, trachea, and mouth would also have to be deeply reverted and decompressed to produce this kind of force and volume, so the body would have to be much larger. They could not do this in their human imitation forms with just the larynx reverted. This is the third Man-O-War song, Hail and Kill. In this one, he's singing with his voice reverted in the backup vocals, so you can hear his natural voice singing along with his human imitation voice at certain points. If the newborn were to speak in English, this is what it would sound like. Again, the roars are a close match, with that guttural, gravelly fluctuation.